The sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Ezra Coleman guided his horse through the rocky canyon that bordered his small ranch in southern Arizona territory. At 42, his weathered face bore the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades staring into the desert's harsh glare, and his calloused hands gripped the reins with the quiet confidence of someone who knew this unforgiving land better than most. Ezra wasn't a man given to words. In the 5 years since he'd settled this remote patch of scrubland 30 miles from the nearest town of Esperanza, he could count on one hand the conversations he'd had that lasted longer than a few minutes. The local shopkeepers knew him as the silent rancher who paid his bills on time and never caused trouble. They didn't know about the ghost that rode with him, or why a man with his obvious education and military bearing had chosen to exile himself to one of the most isolated corners of the territory. The morning had started like any other, checking his small herd of cattle for signs of predators or disease, repairing fence lines damaged by the previous night's wind, and preparing for another day of solitude. But as he rounded a bend in the canyon, following the faint trail that led to a natural spring where his cattle often gathered, an unfamiliar sound cut through the desert stillness. Crying, high-pitched, desperate, and utterly wrong for this place where only the coyotes and ravens broke the silence. Ezra pulled his horse to a stop, his gray eyes scanning the canyon walls and the scattered boulders that dotted the sandy floor. The sound came again, definitely a baby's cry, though how such a thing could exist out here was beyond comprehension. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the trail through this canyon was known only to a handful of people. Dismounting, Ezra tied his horse to a stunted mesquite tree and followed the sound on foot. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, not because he feared the crying infant, but because whatever circumstances had brought a baby to this godforsaken place likely involved danger of some kind. The cries grew louder as he approached a cluster of red sandstone rocks near the canyon's eastern wall. And then he saw it, a sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Nestled in a shallow depression between two large stones lay a bundle of dirty cloth, and from within that bundle came the desperate wails of an infant. But what made Ezra's blood run cold wasn't just the sight of the abandoned child. It was the coiled form of a diamondback rattlesnake, easily 6 feet long, sunning itself on a rock not 3 yards from the crying baby. Jesus Christ! Ezra breathed, the first words he'd spoken aloud in 3 days. Moving with the careful precision of a man who had faced death many times before, Ezra drew his revolver and took aim. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder, and the snake's headless body writhed briefly before going still. The gunshot had startled the baby into momentary silence, but within seconds, the crying resumed with renewed intensity. Ezra holstered his weapon and approached the bundle cautiously, scanning the surrounding rocks for other snakes. When he was certain the immediate area was safe, he knelt beside the infant and carefully pulled back the dirty cloth. The baby was a boy, perhaps 3 or 4 months old, with dark hair and skin bronzed by sun exposure. His tiny face was red from crying and streaked with dirt, and his little fists flailed desperately in the air. But despite his obvious distress, the child appeared unharmed, a miracle considering how long he might have been lying here in the desert heat. "Where the hell did you come from, little one?" Ezra asked quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. As if responding to the sound of human speech, the baby's cries began to subside. Dark eyes, intelligent and alert despite his young age, focused on Ezra's face with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. In that moment, something shifted inside the silent rancher's chest, like ice cracking in spring. Ezra looked around the canyon once more, searching for any sign of how the child had come to be here. There were no wagon tracks, no hoof prints other than his own horses, no indication that anyone else had been in this remote place recently. Whoever had left this baby here had wanted him to die, had chosen the most isolated spot they could find to abandon an innocent child to the desert and its predators. The thought filled Ezra with a rage he hadn't felt since the war, a cold, burning anger at the cruelty of people who would sacrifice the helpless for their own convenience. But beneath that anger was something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: protectiveness. Carefully, Ezra lifted the baby into his arms, surprised by how light and fragile the child felt. The boy had stopped crying entirely now, seemingly content to be held by gentle hands. As Ezra stood there in the canyon, cradling an abandoned infant under the blazing Arizona sun, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Well, boy," he said softly, "looks like you're coming home with me." The ride back to the ranch was unlike any Ezra had ever experienced. With the baby cradled carefully in his left arm and the reins held in his right hand, he found himself moving at a pace that would have embarrassed a Sunday church procession. Every time his horse's gait became too jarring, the infant would begin to fuss, forcing Ezra to slow even further. "Easy there, boy," Ezra found himself murmuring, words that seemed to calm both the baby and his mount. "We'll get you home soon enough." Home. The word felt strange on his lips. For 5 years, his small adobe ranch house had been nothing more than shelter, a place to eat and sleep between the endless tasks of working the land. But somehow, with this tiny life depending on him, it was beginning to feel like something more. The sun was approaching its zenith when they finally reached the modest spread Ezra had carved out of the desert. The main house was simple but well built, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool even during the hottest summer days. A small barn stood nearby, along with a corral that currently held his 3 horses and a milk cow, the extent of his livestock operation. As Ezra dismounted and carried the baby inside, he was struck by how empty and masculine his home appeared. The single room that served as both kitchen and living area contained only the bare necessities: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with canned goods and basic supplies. It was the dwelling of a man who had convinced himself he needed nothing more than solitude and survival. The baby began to cry again, and Ezra realized with growing panic that he had absolutely no idea how to care for an infant. He had never been married, had no siblings, and his military experience had involved leading men into battle, not tending to helpless children. "All right, little one," he said, setting the baby gently on his bed while he tried to think. "What is it you need?" The answer came to him gradually through trial and error. The child was clearly hungry, but Ezra had no milk except what he could get from his cow. Using a clean cloth dipped in fresh milk, he managed to get some nourishment into the baby, though more seemed to end up on both of them than in the child's stomach. Next came the matter of cleanliness. The improvised diaper, made from an old shirt, was soiled beyond repair, and Ezra found himself cutting up one of his few clean undershirts to fashion a replacement. His large, calloused hands fumbled with the delicate task, but the baby seemed patient with his inexperience. As the afternoon wore on, Ezra discovered something remarkable happening. The silence that had been his constant companion for years was being filled not just with the baby's occasional cries, but with his own voice as he found himself talking to the child, explaining what he was doing, describing the ranch, even sharing fragments of memories he had kept buried for years. "Your eyes remind me of someone I used to know," he said quietly as he held the baby near the window, letting him look out at the desert landscape. "A woman back in Missouri, before the war changed everything. Her name was Sarah, and she had the same way of looking at a person like she could see right through to their soul." The baby gurgled softly, as if encouraging him to continue. "She wanted children, you know. Used to talk about the family we'd have after I came back from the fighting. But I never made it back. Not the man she fell in love with, anyway. Too much blood on my hands, too many ghosts following me around." As evening approached, Ezra realized he would need supplies if he was going to properly care for the child. The nearest town, Esperanza, was a hard day's ride away, but it couldn't be avoided. The baby needed proper food, clean clothes, and medical attention to ensure he hadn't suffered any lasting harm from his time in the desert. But taking the baby to town would mean answers to questions Ezra wasn't ready to face. People would want to know where the child had come from, why Ezra had taken him in, and what his intentions were. In a small frontier community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the appearance of a mysterious baby would cause quite a stir. More troubling still was the possibility that whoever had abandoned the child might learn of his survival. Ezra had no way of knowing if the baby had been left to die by desperate parents who couldn't care for him, or if there were darker reasons for his abandonment. Either way, bringing the child into public view would be taking a considerable risk. As night fell over the desert, Ezra sat in his single chair with the baby sleeping peacefully in his arms. The child had accepted him with a trust that was both humbling and terrifying. Here was a life completely dependent on his protection, his care, his ability to make the right decisions. Looking down at the sleeping infant, Ezra made another choice that would reshape his carefully constructed isolation. Tomorrow, he would ride to Esperanza and face whatever questions and consequences came with his decision to save this child. Because some things he was beginning to understand were worth the risk of human connection, even for a man who had spent 5 years running from exactly that. The main street of Esperanza was already bustling with morning activity when Ezra rode in with the baby secured carefully in a sling he'd fashioned from one of his shirts. The small frontier town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of adobe houses, but it served as the social and commercial hub for ranchers and miners scattered across 50 miles of desert territory. Ezra had barely dismounted in front of Mueller's general store when curious eyes began tracking his every movement. The sight of the town's most reclusive resident carrying an infant was enough to stop conversations mid-sentence and draw people from their morning routines. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered old Pete Hawkins from his usual spot on the store's front porch. "That's Ezra Coleman, and unless my eyes are playing tricks, he's got himself a baby." Heinrich Mueller, the German immigrant who owned the general store, emerged from behind his counter as Ezra entered with the infant still sleeping peacefully in the makeshift sling. Mueller was a good man, honest in his dealings and discreet by nature, but even he couldn't hide his surprise. "Mein Gott, Coleman," Mueller said in his thick accent. "Where did this little one come from?" "Found him in the desert," Ezra replied simply, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the truth, if not the whole truth. He needs supplies. Food, clothes, whatever babies require. Mueller's wife, Greta, appeared from the store's back room, drawn by the unusual sight. She was a motherly woman in her 50s who had raised 6 children of her own, and her eyes immediately softened at the sight of the infant. "Asich, the poor little thing," she said, approaching with gentle hands. "May I?" Ezra hesitated for a moment, then carefully transferred the baby to Greta's experienced arms. The child stirred but didn't wake, settling comfortably against the woman's shoulder as if sensing her maternal nature. "He is healthy," Greta observed, running her fingers gently through the baby's dark hair. "Maybe 4 months old, Ja, but he has been in the sun too much. His skin." She looked up at Ezra with questioning eyes. "You say you found him in the desert?" "Canyon near my ranch," Ezra confirmed, watching nervously as more townspeople gathered outside the store's windows. "Been there a while, by the look of things." Word of Ezra's arrival had spread quickly through the small community, and within minutes, the store was filled with curious neighbors. Among them was Sheriff Jim Bradley, a fair-minded man who had served in the territorial law for over a decade. His presence immediately changed the tone of the gathering from curious to official. "Ezra," Bradley nodded, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Folks are saying you found an abandoned baby. That true?" "It is. And you brought him here instead of riding straight to my office because—" Ezra met the sheriff's steady gaze without flinching. "Child needed care first. Questions could wait." Bradley studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the baby still cradled in Greta's arms. "Mind telling me exactly where you found him? Might be folks out there worried sick, looking for their missing child." "Red Rock Canyon, about 5 miles east of my place," Ezra said. "No sign of how he got there. No tracks, no wagon marks, nothing. Whoever left him there didn't want him found." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd at this revelation. The implications were clear to everyone present. The baby hadn't been lost. He'd been deliberately abandoned in one of the most remote and dangerous areas of the territory. "That's a serious accusation," said Reverend Thomas Walsh, the town's preacher, stepping forward from the crowd. To suggest someone would leave an innocent child to die in the desert. I'm not suggesting anything, Ezra replied, his voice growing harder. I'm telling you what I found. A baby left in a place where no decent person would leave a dog. Margaret Keller, the town's schoolteacher and one of its most vocal moral authorities, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her sharp features were set in lines of disapproval as she looked from the baby to Ezra. "And what exactly do you intend to do with this child, Mr. Coleman?" she demanded. "You're a single man living alone in the wilderness. Hardly a suitable environment for raising a young child." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Ezra felt the weight of every eye in the room, the judgment and speculation of people who barely knew him but felt entitled to pass verdict on his life. For a moment, he was tempted to walk away, to leave the baby with these good Christian folk and return to his solitary existence. But then he looked at the infant in Greta's arms, the child who had stopped crying when Ezra spoke to him, who had slept peacefully through the night in a stranger's bed, who had somehow managed to survive alone in a desert canyon until rescue came. "I intend to raise him," Ezra said quietly, but with a conviction that surprised even himself. "Unless his real family comes forward, that boy is mine now." The crowd erupted in whispered conversations and shocked exclamations. Margaret Keller's face flushed red with indignation, while Sheriff Bradley frowned thoughtfully. But it was Greta Mueller who spoke the words that cut through the chaos. "This man saved a child's life," she said firmly, the German accent making her words seem even more authoritative. "Instead of standing here making judgments, maybe we should be asking how we can help him do what is right." As the debates swirled around him, Ezra felt something shift in his chest again. Not the ice cracking this time, but something warmer, stronger. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't facing the world alone. 3 weeks had passed since Ezra's confrontation with the townspeople of Esperanza, and life had settled into a new rhythm at the ranch. The baby, whom Ezra had begun calling Samuel after his own father, was thriving under his inexperienced but devoted care. Greta Mueller had visited twice, bringing supplies and gentle instruction on infant care, while Sheriff Bradley had filed his official report and let the matter rest. But on this particular morning, as Ezra was teaching Samuel to drink from a bottle he'd fashioned from a glass jar and rubber tubing, the sound of approaching horses broke the desert silence. 3 riders were making their way up the long trail to his ranch, and even from a distance, Ezra could see the tension in their posture. The lead rider was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back severely in clothes that spoke of money and social position. Behind her rode 2 men, one clearly a hired gun by his bearing and weapons, the other better dressed but equally dangerous looking. Ezra stepped onto his porch with Samuel in his arms, his free hand resting on his revolver. As the riders drew closer, he could see the woman's face more clearly, sharp features marked by grief and desperation, eyes that held the same dark intelligence as the baby in his arms. "Mr. Coleman," the woman called out as she reined in her horse 20 feet from the porch. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Her gaze fixed on Samuel with an intensity that made Ezra's blood run cold. This wasn't a mother looking for her lost child. This was something else entirely. "Ma'am," Ezra replied carefully, stepping back toward his door. "I don't know what you're talking about." Elena dismounted gracefully, her hand gesturing for her companions to remain mounted but ready. "The baby, Mr. Coleman. The child you found in Red Rock Canyon. He is my nephew, and I've come to take him home." "Your nephew?" Ezra studied her face, noting the resemblance to Samuel's features. "Where's his mother then? His father?" Pain flickered across Elena's composed features. "Both dead. My sister Maria died giving birth to him, and the father was never in the picture. The child was placed with a family in Santa Fe, but She paused, choosing her words carefully. "They proved unsuitable guardians. Unsuitable enough to dump him in the desert to die." Ezra's voice carried an edge of steel that made the hired gun's hand drift toward his weapon. Elena's composure cracked slightly. "That was never supposed to happen. The people I hired to transport him to new arrangements, they took matters into their own hands when they realized the child was part Apache. Rather than face my wrath for their prejudice, they chose to make him disappear entirely. The pieces began falling into place for Ezra. Samuel's darker complexion, his intelligent dark eyes, the fact that he'd been abandoned in such a remote location, it all made sense now. In 1880s Arizona territory, a half-Apache child would face a lifetime of prejudice and discrimination, even from those paid to care for him. And now you want to take him away to what? Ezra asked. Another family that might abandon him when his heritage becomes inconvenient? I want to take him home to Mexico, Elena said firmly. To family who will accept him for who he is, not reject him for what he is. Ezra looked down at Samuel, who was staring up at him with those bright, trusting eyes. The baby had no idea his entire future was being decided by strangers on a dusty ranch porch. All he knew was that the man holding him meant safety and comfort. And if I refuse? Ezra asked quietly. The hired gun shifted in his saddle, but Elena raised a hand to stop him. Mr. Coleman, I can see you care for the child, but you're a single man living in isolation. What kind of life can you offer him? What happens when he grows older and starts asking questions about where he came from, about why he looks different from you? The questions hit closer to home than Ezra cared to admit. He had been wondering the same things during the sleepless nights when Samuel cried and he fumbled with bottles and diapers. What did he know about raising a child, let alone one who would face the additional challenges of mixed heritage in a hostile world? But then Samuel grabbed his finger with surprising strength, and Ezra remembered the feeling of that first night, the ice cracking in his chest, the sense of purpose returning to his life after years of emptiness. I reckon, Ezra said slowly, that what matters most is whether a child is loved and protected. Everything else, the questions, the challenges, the prejudice, we'll face them together when the time comes. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she seemed to find there. You would truly keep him? Raise him as your own son, knowing the difficulties that await. I already am raising him as my own son, Ezra replied, and I've faced difficult things before. We both have, I'd guess. For the first time since arriving, Elena smiled, a sad, genuine expression that transformed her entire face. You know, Mr. Coleman, I think my sister would have liked you. She always said the measure of a man wasn't his blood or his breeding, but his willingness to do what was right when it mattered most. She remounted her horse, surprising both Ezra and her companions. The child stays with you, with one condition. If you ever find you cannot care for him, or if he ever wants to know about his mother's family, you send word to Elena Vasquez in Guadalajara. Can you promise me that? Ezra nodded solemnly. You have my word. As the three riders disappeared back into the desert, Ezra looked down at Samuel, his son now, in every way that mattered. The silence of the ranch had been broken forever, replaced by something far more precious, the sound of family, imperfect and unexpected, but real. Well, Sam, he said softly, looks like it's just you and me against the world. Think we can handle it? Samuel gurgled happily, and in that sound, Ezra heard all the answer he needed.